John Cage was one of the great American composers of the 20th century. He had an extraordinary gift in that he didn't so much push the boundaries of music as just completely redefined them and hurtled past them. His musical works defy definition. They demonstrate the full creative capacity of the human mind. One of his most challenging pieces is entitled ASLSP, which is written for the pipe organ. ASLSP is so innovative and so irregular that I would dare say that there is no single organist who is talented enough, or there is no single organist who could ever play it. And this isn't because there isn't an organist who doesn't have the skill or the talent, but rather the longevity. For you see, ASLSP is longer than the average organ piece. An old church in Halberstadt, Germany was selected as the venue for this musical piece to be performed. The performance began on September 5th, 2001, and it will conclude on the same day, only 639 years later. And in case you're wondering, the length of time of 639 years was chosen because it was 639 years before that day in September 2001 that the first pipe organ was installed in a church. It was installed in Halberstadt, Germany. Notes are played for 1 to 8 years at a time. Usually when there's a key change, a good-sized crowd comes out to hear it. The last one took place on July 5th. And hundreds of people showed up and cheered when the attendants shifted the weights which hold down the foot pedals. The next key change will take place this October, and it will be the last one until 2020. Pipe organ is perfect for such things because as long as it is technically maintained, if you place your finger on an organ key, it never stops playing until you remove your finger or the mechanism gives out. Also incorporated in the song are prolonged periods of silence. In fact, the song itself began with a 17-month-long period of silence. Now, I have a friend who's a talented musician, and he's told me before that good musicians, they know exactly how to use the notes to their fullest, to play them just the right way. However, a truly great musician also understands exactly how to use the silence. Now, it occurs to me when we read this story from Elijah that God must be a great musician because he knows exactly how to use silence. We see that in this story of God's encounter with Elijah in a little cave on the side of a mountain. Now, this story is very closely related to the one that we read last week. So, for those of you who weren't here, let me give you the 1-minute Cliff's Notes version of that story. Elijah has been working as a prophet in Israel. This is the northern kingdom of Israel. Israel is ruled by Ahab and his wife, Queen Jezebel. They are idolaters, they're bad people, and are leading Israel further and further away from fidelity to God. Specifically, Jezebel is a devotee to the god Baal. So Elijah, Ahab, and Jezebel, they fight, and things go back and forth for a while, but eventually there has to be a showdown, and it happens on Mount Carmel, outside the capital. Following God's instruction, Elijah challenges Baal's prophets, and in a climactic confrontation, Elijah prevails against them, and in fact, puts hundreds of them to the sword. It's at this juncture that those of us who grew up learning morality from Walt Disney expect the good guys to win, the bad guys to fall, and the end of the movie to finally come around. We expect the people of Israel to rise up against their sinful leaders and overthrow them and return to God. We expect wrong to be made right. We expect good to win out over evil. We want Ahab to be chased from the throne and Jezebel to be mocked and disgraced. But life is rarely a Disney movie. And even though Elijah, with the help of God, wins a stunning and dramatic victory, he has to quickly flee. Israel doesn't stay faithful to God. Ahab stays on the throne, and we find out that Jezebel has issued a death warrant against Elijah. Elijah is the hero. This is supposed to be his moment, and he has to flee for his life. And when I say he has to flee, he has to travel as far as he can, as fast as he can. The Bible tells us that he first runs to the wilderness in Judea. Now, this is the time of the two kingdoms, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. You can see them there. Elijah is in the northern kingdom of Israel. He has to flee, the Bible says, into Judah. This is a place where Ahab and Jezebel, it's beyond their jurisdiction. They're not the kings and they're not the king and queen of this land. And yet he doesn't even feel safe in Jerusalem or the other cities in Judea. He's hiding out in the sticks. But then he decides that this isn't even far enough to escape Jezebel's wrath, and so he has to flee even further south. So he heads further south into this area. Maybe you probably can't read it, but below the purple it says wilderness. He wanders and flees into the wilderness of the Sinai desert. For 40 days and 40 nights he runs. By the way, just as an aside, a little trick which helps when reading the Bible, when you read the number 40 in a story, it's not just a month of 10 days. The meaning is deeper than that. It's a symbol for preparation. When Israel wanders for 40 years through the deserts because they're being prepared. When Jesus is tempted for 40 days out in the wilderness by Satan, it's because he's being prepared. And as Elijah runs for 40 days and 40 nights, he is being prepared. God has something in store for him. And I really feel for Elijah during this time. He's done everything he was supposed to do. He's kept the faith. He's done the right thing even when it was not popular. Everything God has asked of him, he's done, even when the odds seem grim. And as he wanders into the deserts of the Sinai, walking toward Mount Horeb, in so many words, the Bible tells us that Elijah falls deep, deep into a state of depression. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but I think at times it's happened to me, and it's happened to other people as well. I don't think Elijah is being melodramatic when he complains to the Lord, God, I've done everything you wanted me to do. I gave up popularity. I was ridiculed. I exhausted myself pursuing your goals. And this is my reward. Elijah literally and truly wishes he were dead. So Elijah finds himself in a cave, way beyond the boundaries of Israel and Judah, out in the wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula. This is a place where Ahab's armies and henchmen would never look for him. But for all of its benefits as a hiding place, it's a rather lousy place to live. There's no water, there's no food, it's dry and hot. It's kind of dangerous to be out there alone. This is what he's reduced to, hiding out in a cave. We know he's being prepared for something, but we don't know what. It's not yet. He's on Mount Horeb. By the way, Mount Horeb is the name that the people in the northern kingdom call this mountain. For most of Israel's history, they call it by a different name, Mount Sinai. He's on the very mountain where Moses first encountered God, where the children of Israel received the commandments and the law. Maybe he hasn't thought about it, but Elijah is hiding out on sacred ground. And as the story says, an earthquake occurs, a gale of wind blows, a great and terrible fire burns, and God is not in any of those things. God is still nowhere to be found. And then there's a deafening silence. The Hebrew here, we don't exactly know what it means. Most of the time the translators write that there was a sound of sheer silence, or there was the sound of a gentle whisper or a still small voice. But it also can mean a quiet or gentle breeze. And in that, whatever it is, Elijah hears an almost imperceptible whisper. And even though God isn't in the fire, he's not in the earthquake, he's not in the big dramatic things, God is in that whisper. Well, why can't God be in the fire or the earthquake or the wind? Sometimes I think we want God to speak into our lives in big dramatic fashions like that. We want God to show up in a choir of angels like it happened at Jesus' birth. We want God to follow us in a pillar of cloud as he did for Israel. Some way where there would be no mistaking that it was God. We want the majesty of the heavens opened up for all to behold. I want God to manifest God's self in the revival of the nations. I want to find God in the bigness and the noise of life. Last year I went to see Chris Tomlin perform. He's a praise singer. He was at this big mega church, and the music shook it. It shook the whole building. It was a great show, and I wanted so badly for God to speak through the sheer magnitude of that event. This week, many of you had the opportunity to see the full majesty of worship unfold during annual conference, just a few blocks up the street at Polk Street. And the granddaddy of conference worship events is ordination. All the clergy of the conference process in their robes and stoles. It's replete with pomp and ceremony. There are dignitaries and bishops that pray and offer wise and thoughtful sermons. It's a dramatic spectacle. But what this story seems to say in 1 Kings is that the quiet, still moments when God encounters us in a close, subtle way may be more important. In fact, the story kind of makes me wonder if all of those big dramatic things we try to do, all the big concerts and revivals and everything else, are we just trying to conjure up God in those? And what does that say about us if we feel that our God has to be brought about in some dramatic production that we put on? Elijah finds God in the gentle, still whisper in the dark. Silence is so important. In the silence, God can whisper your name. God can speak to your fears and dreams and longings and insecurities. God can always find you in the quiet times. So where are you finding your quiet time? That's the hard part. I'm sure most of you, and this is certainly the case for me, it's hard to find a quiet moment to listen to God. Most of us who have to live in the hectic world of modernity don't really value quiet time. I go so far as to say that most modern people, myself included, don't know how to handle quiet. We're made uncomfortable by it. It's uncomfortable, isn't it? But God seems to say that the silence, the quiet, is critically necessary in our lives. Is it just coincidence that instruction for weekly rest finds itself in the Ten Commandments? It's right there next to love God, don't worship idols, don't kill people. Rest once a week. Every week, find a day to not be busy, to not surround yourself with the noise of life, but to just be quiet and be with God. We need time to quiet, times of rest, and times of stillness. Aidan Clark puts it this way: imagine your soul being like a bridge built over a river. Traffic must cross that bridge, and at times the traffic can be quite congested. But the bridge will carry the weight for a time. However, periodically, the bridge must be maintained. And when it is, it can be weighed down. When it is maintained, it can be weighed down at that time with the regular traffic. Your soul, too, can take the weight of your daily life, but only when it is maintained. The time to repair the bridge is in the quiet times, in the night, when the traffic is light. Your prayer in the quiet times gives you the strength to cope with the heavy, busy times. The story of Elijah on Mount Horeb seems to say that God's true glory is really, truly revealed in the quiet whispers that come to us through the silence. We find meaning and peace in the silence. God whispers to us, I know who you are. What are you doing here? Silence is a place of awesome and holy power. William Lawrence, who is the dean at Perkins School of Theology, tells the story of 3 instances where he saw the power as it can be found, where he saw power as it can be found in silence. First, he tells of a nuclear reactor, a nuclear power plant, which he had the opportunity to tour as it was being constructed. And they took him and the other people through this cement chamber where uranium would eventually be split. And he recalled the echoes of the voices in the chamber of the construction workers as they were working. A human voice will never be heard in that room again because it will be highly radioactive for the next 10,000 years or so. But power is created there, which lights up literally millions of homes. Next, he talked about living in North Carolina, where when Hurricane Hugo blew across the town where he lived. And he recalled the awesome, terrifying silence in the eye of the hurricane, sandwiched between the 2 cataclysmic cycles of the storm. And he realized that the power and awesome force of the storm was what created the peace and the quiet and the silence in the eye. And finally, he talks about the sacred power he found on a quiet night in Scranton, Pennsylvania, when he was ordained as a minister of the church. And he writes, I was kneeling at the altar in a United Methodist church building. The hands of a bishop were placed on my head, and the arms and hands of an uncounted number of robed figures surrounded me, covered me, and clothed me as if I were in a tent. All the robes were black in those days, so the warm and human place became a place of near total darkness. And in the midst of the darkness, the bishop spoke some words that announced that I was being granted authority to administer the sacraments and preach the word. The act of ordination in what felt like a tent akin to the itinerant sanctuary that the people of the Old Testament carried with them in their wanderings occurred in a place that was dark and damp and filled with the power of holy mystery. There's great power in silence. There is such great power in the gentle whispers that our busy, noisy lives drown out. There is such awesome and humbling power in the longings and yearnings we encounter in the quiet and still moments. Take the time to find those moments. Your schedule will never permit them. The hectic grind of life will never squeeze them in unless you take the time for them. Take time for quiet because God will speak to you in those moments. And if we never find a quiet moment, then God's voice just might be drowned out by something less important. John Cage, that musician who wrote ASLSP, which by the way means as slow as possible, he wrote another song. He called it 432. Unlike ASLSP, which no musician could ever play, 432 can be played by just about anyone because 432 stands for 4 minutes and 32 seconds, as in 4 minutes and 32 seconds of silence. The only thing you need is a musician to sit at a piano or an organ or another instrument and play absolutely nothing. According to Cage, in that time, the song comes from the small, subtle sounds that occur around the performance, the tiny noises made by the audience, the sounds of doors opening or air conditioners shutting on or legs being crossed. If it's performed outdoor, then it's joined by the sounds of the birds in the sky or leaves rustling in the wind. And in that sense, every performance of this song has a unique beauty in it. Maybe that's how it is with God. When we push the preconceived notions aside, when we make room for the tiny, almost imperceptible yearnings that He sends our way, in our big moments and our low moments, maybe that's just how God speaks into our lives. That's how He did it with Elijah. And that's how He can do it with us. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.